All right. All right, it's been a wonderful conference so far. We're going to move on to our third and final speaker, and that is Laila Kassam. I will say that the Humane Hoax Online Conference, this event is hosted by our Humane Hoax Project, which is a collaborative grassroots effort of activists working together to reveal the truth about humane, quote unquote, humane animal farming. Just a reminder, please keep your audio muted, utilize the chat. Any thoughts, questions, comments, things you want to expand on or want to hear the speakers expand on, put in the chat because we will be having the Q&A right after Layla's presentation. So, okay, we're going to move into her talk. So, Laila Kassam is a founder and director of Project Phoenix, cultivating a national network of organizations and individuals working towards shared goals for animal freedom in the UK. Layla is the co-founder and former director of Animal Think Tank, where she served for 6 years and where I followed her work with great interest and really was inspired by her work there. She is the co-editor of the book Rethinking Food and Agriculture: New Ways Forward, which envisions a truly just and sustainable food system. She also has her PhD in development economics and previously worked in international development for 15 years. And I'm really excited to see what she's going to do with her new project, Project Phoenix. And I'm so glad she was willing to join us today. So I'm going to turn it over now to Laila Kassam.
Great. Thank you so much, Hope. Okay, I want to begin by telling you all about a pig called Charlie. Charlie was found on a farm certified by the RSPCA Assured Scheme as higher welfare. She had a large growth on her head. She was in a lot of pain, and investigators removed her from the farm, got her veterinary treatment, and brought her to Sanctuary, where she is now safe and cared for. She is known as someone, not something, and she is free. But Charlie's story sits in tension with another story because at the same time that Charlie was suffering on this RSPCA assured farm, the RSPCA and the RSPCA assured was telling the public that everything was fine, the system was working, animals were leading good lives. Now, those two stories can't both be true. And that tension between what an animal experiences and what institutions tell us to believe is what I want to explore in this talk. Because, I mean, I think as we all know, it points to something much bigger than one farm or one scheme. It points to how harm gets made acceptable and how exploitation gets framed as high welfare, and how sometimes, without meaning to, movements for social justice like ours can reinforce the very stories that they set out to challenge. But before I go on to talk about what that story is costing us, I just want to give us a lens through which we can understand how this all works. And that lens is about how stories operate. So, stories fundamentally are the ideas that we live by. They tell us what is fair, what's normal, who's responsible, what's realistic, what's too much to ask. And most importantly, stories set the boundaries of what people think is possible. And, people don't take in facts in a vacuum. We fit new information into what we already believe. If it fits, we accept it. If it doesn't, we often reject it, not because we are completely irrational, but because that is just how our minds work. And that is why, I'm sure many of you have had this experience. That's why you can show someone very convincing evidence about, the harms of farming animals, and they walk away unconvinced. Because the evidence that you shared landed inside a story in their mind, that they already believe about what farming is, whether it's necessary, whether it's natural, whether it's being managed responsibly. And George Lakoff calls these the frames that we think through. And the most important thing about a frame is that when it's working, you don't notice it. You just think that you're being reasonable. And I think we probably also all know that stories do something that statistics can't. They don't just tell people what to think, they tell people what and who to care about and why now is the moment to act. So social justice movements succeed or fail partly based on whether their story competes effectively with the stories told by more powerful institutions than the dominant culture. And when a movement's most credible organizations align with a dominant harmful story, they don't just reinforce that story, but they also close off space for different stories. And the reason I'm laying this out is because I think it really helps to explain something that otherwise looks like, just a marketing problem. So, welfare washing, as far as I'm concerned, is not primarily a marketing or misinformation problem, which is how I often see it talked about. Because a marketing or a misinformation problem can be solved with better information, clearer labeling, more honest advertising. But the function of welfare labels isn't just about informing consumers. It's actually about sustaining a story, a collective story that society tells itself about what kind of industry this is and whether it's compatible with being a decent, good, moral society. And, this is much harder to change than a misleading label. So we're up against it. Now, before I go further, I want to be, clear, I suppose, about my position because, conversations like this can become quite polarized. The argument for welfare reform has merit. It comes from a compassionate place. It comes from a recognition that animals suffering right now can't wait for some, perfect political future that may never come. And incremental welfare wins have built political influence. They have helped to normalize concern for other animals, and they have reduced suffering. And I also want to be honest and transparent about an aspect of my argument that I'm going to be making in this talk, which is quite difficult because, if an organization like the RSPCA withdraws its endorsement from a welfare scheme, those farms are not going to close and, the animals on them would still be there. Perhaps and probably likely with lower welfare and even less regulation. And that is a cost. It's a real cost. And I don't want to dismiss that. But at the same time, the institutional endorsement also carries a cost. And that cost is one that operates at the level of story or public narrative, what the public believes is possible, rather than at the level of individual animal suffering. And I think that cost is higher than we tend to acknowledge. Maybe not in this Zoom room, but definitely in the movement. I think that cost is much higher than we acknowledge, and I think it's a really worrying cost. And I would also say that, not all welfare reforms carry this cost. I don't think all welfare reform is detrimental to animal freedom. I think, as we've talked about, what matters as much as the reform itself is the story that it's embedded in. Like, what is the message that is being told to the public? And that's something that I'm going to come back to. Okay, with that said, I want to explore a question that I don't feel that the movement has examined seriously enough. Does reducing suffering within a system move us closer to ending it? Or can welfare reform, depending on how it's framed, sometimes stabilize the system that it's trying to improve? Because there is a big difference between reducing harm inside a system and making that system feel so problematic that it can't continue. And I think what we want to be doing is the latter. And as I said, welfare washing, it's usually described as misleading labels or marketing or misinformation. And in the UK, we have certification schemes using language like high welfare or higher welfare. In the US, as Leah has shown, there's Humane certified. There's retailers using terms like free range or cage free. So I'm less interested in whether a particular label meets a specific set of welfare standards. What I think interests me much more is what is the story that those labels are telling us. And I think the greenwashing literature gives us quite a useful lens. So Delmas and Barbano's 2011 analysis of why firms engage in greenwashing shows that it's not just about misleading claims. It's actually about managing public standing through selective disclosure. So emphasizing favorable information and at the same time concealing and hiding unfavorable information. So welfare washing operates in the same way. It's emphasizing green fields and like happy animals, while at the same time hiding and concealing the slaughter and the separation. Um, and then beyond the sort of firm level, organizational theorists have also shown that industries work at the cultural level, shaping the norms that determine what counts as acceptable in the first place. And welfare washing, I think, operates similarly. It's not just a marketing tactic or an industry defense, it operates as a broader cultural story that shapes how the public understands harm. And so, what this does at the level of story is shift the question being asked. The question stops being, should we be doing this at all? Should this thing exist? To, are we doing this well enough? And these are two very, very different questions because when harm and exploitation is framed as simply a management problem, it then stops being a legitimacy problem. It becomes something that we can fix through auditing or certification, improvement. But the system itself remains intact. And the story basically reassures us that yeah, fine, the problem might exist, but not here. It's being very responsibly managed. You can just chill out, you can relax. And so I think welfare washing works less by persuading people to change how they act and more by reshaping how the public understands harm. And, it shifts the conversation from injustice to improvement. It shifts it from, is this right, to, is this being managed well? And so farming animals in our society feels reasonable and demanding that it ends feels extreme, not because people don't care, but because the story has defined what caring looks like. So, if the story shapes how harm is understood, what does that do to attitudes and behavior? Well, some research shows that welfare labels, unsurprisingly, increase people's perception that animals are treated well. It reduces guilt, it increases people's willingness to buy. So, fundamentally, the label doesn't just inform people, it soothes their consciences. And people don't just update their opinions when they hear new information, they update their perception of reality. So, research by Laffman and colleagues has shown that how we categorize and think about animals directly shapes how much suffering we attribute to them and how much moral concern we feel. So, when an animal is framed as food, people judge them as less capable of suffering, even people who've never eaten that particular animal. And I think a welfare label extends this further because it doesn't just categorize the animal as food, it categorizes them as a happy food animal, one that was well treated, whose suffering has been addressed. And I think that categorization does even more psychological work. It doesn't just reduce the question of suffering, it resolves that question for people. So in some sense, the animal didn't change, but the story changed. And that then changes what people allow themselves to see. But I mean, you don't need experiments in a laboratory setting to see this working. Like the mechanism operates at scale every day through the welfare language in supermarket ads, in what we see in the news, in statements from trusted institutions. All of it creates this background atmosphere of reassurance. The system is accountable. The problem is being managed. Someone is handling it. So I think the label matters not because people read it and update their views. I think it matters more because it's just one more way that the wider cultural story gets reproduced. You don't need to have seen the logo necessarily to have absorbed what it stands for. You just need to live in the dominant culture. So when a trusted institution like the RSPCA endorses a farming practice, the endorsement doesn't just improve the practice, it washes it. For me, this is what welfare washing really is. It's not just marketing spin, it is a legitimacy transfer, a transfer of legitimacy. So, for example, when the RSPCA certifies a farming system, 200 years of accumulated trust transfers not just to the product on the shelf that's been labeled, but all of that trust transfers to the system behind that product and label, to the system of farming other animals. And that transfer doesn't depend on whether a shopper recognizes the label. I think it operates upstream. So it shapes what politicians defend, it shapes what journalists treat as normal, it shapes what the public understands as responsible. So the endorsement doesn't just signal that this product is better, I think it signals that the whole system is legitimate. And I think that is what we're up against. So if the system is legitimate, that's the story. Why would anyone stop participating in it? Why would anyone feel like they needed to stop participating in it? And I think this helps to explain why welfare labeled meat is actually not a stepping stone to animal-free diets. And an EA researcher who supports welfare reform called Stijn Brewers tested this empirically in a 2024 paper and found that rather than being a stepping stone, welfare labeled meat becomes a new destination. So when the problem feels like it's being handled, the pressure to question the system and to question our choices dissolves. And I feel like this is intuitively how I would understand things. So it's nice to have some kind of empirical support for that. A 2025 experimental study found that positive welfare labels activate a psychological mechanism called moral licensing, which makes meat consumption feel more ethically acceptable. And again, this aligns with my own experience, and I'm sure many people listening will have had this experience. I've had so many friends and acquaintances tell me that they only eat high welfare meat as their justification for eating animals. They feel like they genuinely feel like they're doing the right thing because their moral discomfort is being taken care of by this story. And this, as much as I would like to think it's not hypocrisy. It is just how our minds work. So when we feel like we're being responsible, this urgency to change things softens. That discomfort that drives change eases. And as Farah said, movements depend on urgency, on the sense that something is at stake and something important needs a response from us, and we need to act. But if the welfare framing is actually systematically reducing and dissolving and like diffusing that urgency, whether it's through a label or whether it's through the broader cultural story, it weakens the conditions for collective action. So I think the question isn't simply, does welfare reform reduce suffering? It's, does welfare framing reduce the moral pressure that is needed to challenge and change the system? So, to be clear, I'm not saying that welfare reform has provably delayed abolition by any measurable amount. That's not a claim that I think anyone can make about social change. What I am arguing, though, is that the story that welfare washing tells makes challenging the system harder because it changes the emotional, the psychological, the political terrain on which that challenge has to happen. And, industries don't collapse because their standards get better. They collapse when their legitimacy erodes, when enough people stop believing that the system has a right to exist. So legitimacy determines whether politicians defend an industry, whether the media treat that industry as normal, whether consumers and the public feel morally safe participating in that industry. So when the dominant story is, the worst abuses are addressed, responsible options exist, the system is improving, we're making progress, then the farming of other animals becomes less scandalous, less urgent, and less politically risky to defend. Okay, so now I want to share a counterexample of what I'm saying, and that is the example of Austria. So cage-free campaigning began there in the early 1990s, and legislation banning battery cages was passed in 2004, taking effect in 2009. And then enriched cages were phased out by 2020. And it seems that a ban on barn eggs is now in the works. So this is a case of consecutive rounds of reform, each building on the last. And so welfare reform is, functioning as a genuine ratchet, like it's increasing over time. So often people who promote cage-free campaigns and effective altruists point to Austria as an example of why, cage-free campaigning is and welfare campaigns are correct. So VGT, or the Association Against Animal Factories, is Austria's most prominent animal rights campaigning organization, and it played a large role in these victories, a very large role. Um, but what distinguishes them is that their stated goal was and always, I think, has been animal rights, not welfare improvement. So, from their own materials, they say there is no ethically acceptable reason to limit basic rights to members of the human species only. And the founder, Martin Balloch, describes choosing winnable targets strategically and targets that are supported by a majority of the electorate, while never accepting that winning them was the destination. So the reforms were a means, not an end. So VGT has won bans, legal bans on battery cages, but also fur farming, wild animals in circuses, and the use of apes in experiments, and other bans. So I would, I'm viewing these as not necessarily welfare improvements within a system. I think these are prohibitions. They're practices that are removed from the set of things that society permits. And I don't think that Martin Balloch would agree with this label, but to me, this is the logic of abolition applied incrementally. And I think Farah's talked about this. It's like we can have incremental changes, but the message and the goal needs to be clear. And abolitionism is often caricatured as being against incremental change, as if the only pure position we would accept is total liberation, and we would refuse any win short of that. I don't personally feel like that's the case, and VGT's record makes it clear that that isn't right. The ask can be incremental, but the story and the messaging and the goal doesn't have to be. And I think in Austria, the ratchet basically turned because the underlying story never shifted. VGT didn't frame battery cage bans as proof that the system could be humane. They framed them as one step towards ending exploitation. And that I think that framing difference is what kept the pressure building rather than dissolving. So, I think a question for our movement is not necessarily whether a welfare reform is worth pursuing, it's whether we are telling the Austrian story, or what we at Project Phoenix would like to call the story of animal freedom. Or are we telling a story that actually legitimizes a harmful system? And I think, when the story is clear, the fight about tactics and the infighting becomes less necessary. Um, okay. So I think for me, the more interesting question isn't so much welfare or abolition. I think a more interesting question for me is, does this reform reduce legitimacy of the system, or does it reinforce it? And that is the question I think I would like to invite us to ask of every campaign, every certification, every win. And also, even in Austria, where reform has worked as a ratchet, it has taken decades. So I think another question we should be asking is, what strategies collapse the legitimacy of animal exploitation more directly and more quickly? Improving a system and making that system feel politically untenable are not the same things, because when we reduce legitimacy of a system, political protection weakens. And I think it's in that space where structural change becomes most possible. Okay, so back to welfare washing. I want to make this more concrete for you. So, the most striking example of this legitimacy transfer that I've talked about in the UK animal movement, it's not from a corporation or retailers, it's from an animal protection charity, the RSPCA, the oldest and most trusted animal charity in the UK. And when a trusted animal charity certifies farming practices, it directly shapes the cultural and political story for media, for politicians, for industry, for the public. It says that this system can be kind, this system can be ethical. So that signal doesn't require consumers to read and recognize the label. It works by shaping what institutions treat as normal, what journalists report without any scrutiny, what politicians feel safe defending, and what the public understands is the responsible and the moral choice. The endorsement operates really importantly at the level of culture and sort of public narrative, not so much just the label and just the packaging. So, remember Charlie? She came from an RSPCA assured farm, and that farm was certified higher welfare, but she was found sick and in pain. And actually, many of the other pigs on that farm were also similarly suffering. And if she hadn't have been rescued by investigators, she would have been killed a long time ago, perhaps even in an RSPCA assured slaughterhouse. And at the same time that she was suffering, the RSPCA assured was running adverts showing, bucolic, small scale family farms. So nearly 100 investigations over 18 years have documented systemic suffering on RSPCA assured farms and slaughterhouses. The vast majority are intensive farms, what most of us would consider factory farms. So animals are confined, mutilated, bred for high so-called yield to be profitable, regardless of the health consequences. And, they're denied their freedom to be with their families, to play, to live, and to grow old. So in 2024, Animal Rising in the UK ran a campaign asking the RSPCA to drop the assured scheme. And Animal Rising investigated nearly 40 RSPCA assured farms and 4 slaughterhouses. And Chris Packham and Caroline Lucas, very high profile president and vice president of the RSPCA, they resigned as a result of this campaign. The For Charlie Coalition, which I and Project Phoenix are part of, also supported the campaign with an open letter to the RSPCA. And Brian May, another famous vice president, resigned following our open letter. So that caused a lot of media. So there was a lot of media, and that triggered a lot of public conversation. But the campaign didn't achieve its goal. So we are launching a new coalition effort this year. So watch this space. But it is a contested campaign. Many people, particularly those focused on welfare reforms in the movement and, effective altruists focused on suffering reduction, many people and organizations think it's not the best use of movement resources. Obviously, I disagree, and so do many others as well. We got 60 plus pro-animal organizations to sign our open letter. And much of the grassroots in the UK, this is a very deeply felt issue. So I think there's a lot of people also who think that it is exactly the right target. And that's because given just how much public trust the RSPCA carries in the UK, removing that moral cover will change what people in the UK think farming animals means. I think it will really help them to question whether there is actually a kind way to farm other animals. After all, it's in their name, Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And certifying a system that is so inherently cruel is not an extension of that mission. It's a contradiction of it. And I don't know if I'm going too far, but I think that, it's not so different from UNICEF promoting ethical sweatshops or Save the Children endorsing responsible child marriage. We wouldn't accept that. So I really don't think we should be accepting this from the RSPCA. So what we're doing is asking the RSPCA to basically stop providing the one thing that only they can provide, which is the moral authority of the UK's oldest and most trusted animal charity. We're asking them to stop lending their name to a system that so many investigations have documented causing systemic and heartbreaking suffering. And we're asking the RSPCA to actually live up to its slogan, for every kind. Um, because right now the RSPCA's name is being used to certify factory farming as acceptable, and by extension, all the farming and killing of animals, and it's making it seem as though it's something that can be made permanently compatible with a decent and good and moral society, and we don't believe that it can be. So to be fair to the RSPCA, it is an inside game actor. So inside game actors, those are the ones negotiating with governments and pushing for legislative change. And they do operate under real constraints. These actors, they do in organizations, they need political access, they need credibility, they need these relationships in order to do their work. But I would say that not all inside game work needs to be like this. An organization lobbying government for legislative change while also publicly saying that farming animals is wrong, is doing something very different from an organization that's running a consumer facing certification scheme that tells people that exploitation is being responsibly managed. The first uses institutional access to push forward a transformative goal. And the second, which is what the RSPCA is doing, uses institutional credibility to basically stabilize the system. So, I think the problem isn't necessarily, working within institutions, working sort of on the inside. It's that their position is being used to fundamentally narrow the public story rather than push it forward. And we think that they can push the story forward while also doing the lobbying and legislative work that they do. Um, but even the most principled inside game work carries a structural risk because access to power shapes language and language shapes imagination. So when you spend years negotiating what is politically possible, you start to internalize the limits of what the people in power are willing to concede. So, over time, those limits become your limits, the limits of your imagination, and what you think is realistic becomes a ceiling rather than what you think is possible should become the ceiling. And I think Naomi Klein makes a version of this argument about the climate movement that decades of inside game negotiations over carbon markets and efficiency standards came at the cost of genuinely transforming the fossil fuel economy. So the reasonable became the obstacle to the necessary. And I think that we face this same dynamic in the animal movement. And, that's why movements can't rely solely on inside game strategies to expand what people believe is possible. The work of making the unthinkable thinkable or the probable possible, showing that freedom, not just better conditions, is the goal. That work falls to and has always fallen to those outside of the corridors of power, those who can ask the harder questions because they don't have to rely on those relationships that they're trying to maintain. Those who can really challenge whether the system should exist at all. And historically, movements have needed both. They've needed the inside game reformers who translate pressure into policy, and it's needed outside game actors who create that pressure in the first place. So, I think a healthy movement needs tension. And when the reform side of things becomes dominant and unchallenged, and as I've said, as responsible becomes a ceiling, and when outside pressure disappears for various reasons, often because it's not resourced very well, what happens is the system that we're fighting against stabilizes and the movement itself stagnates. And I think, we've talked a little bit about, infighting. Often, I sort of feel like this is used as a sort of way to silence, differing perspectives. And also this idea of unity. Oh, we must be united. And well, for me, unity doesn't mean uniformity. But also, I don't think the goal is harmony. I think that we need productive friction. I think we need generative conflict. And that is how we really move forward and working in synergy so that some people are working on sort of that ratcheting up the floor while others are actively expanding what is possible, what is seen as possible. And I think that balance and having that balance in the movement ecosystem determines whether reform becomes a bridge to something bigger and better and more transformative, or whether it just becomes a new destination that makes further change harder. So back to Charlie. She's safe. She has space and sunlight and the chance to be herself. Um, but as I said, the farm that she came from was certified as higher welfare. And I think that tells us something about the story that we are living inside of. Charlie doesn't just show that the welfare story is wrong, she also shows us what the right story is. Charlie's situation and story is not an argument for higher welfare standards because that clearly didn't work in Charlie's case and it doesn't work in so many cases, or any cases really, because what animals need is not better conditions, they need their freedom. So Charlie is an argument for freedom, and every animal on every farm, certified or not, is making the same argument. And I should say it's not just on every farm, it's in every facility, in every place where exploitation is happening. these animals are an argument for freedom. They deserve their freedom, and welfare standards are just not going to cut it. So, the most important question for me is, like I said, it's not so much welfare versus abolition, it's whether our stories and our interventions stabilize the system that we're trying to transform, or do they challenge it? Do our stories and interventions narrow what people think is possible, or do they expand it? Because we need stories that hold the tension open rather than resolving it like welfare labels do. We need institutions that expand what people believe is possible rather than containing it. And we need a movement that knows the difference between negotiating for reforms and expanding that horizon. So just to finish, hope is not the belief that change is inevitable. Hope is active. It's choosing to speak and act as if freedom is realistic, even before it feels that way. The role of social movements and every single one of us is not to mirror what feels possible, it's to change it. And the stories that we tell are what drive that change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Layla. That was incredible. Makes me want to cry. I mean, I just having all three of the presentations today, just it's amazing. I mean, it gives me hope. It gives me hope. Even though I am hope, I need hope. So that all gives me hope that, we're all thinking about these things deeply and when the direction of the movement and what's happening and the direction of the industry. There's a lot of levels and a lot of layers to the humane hoax. And I appreciate the three speakers we had today were just amazing, incredible. Okay, so we're going to move into our Q&A section. I'm just going to keep the recording going and we'll record the Q&A as well. And I'll start and I took so many notes and I have a lot of questions. So I might start with a couple of my questions, but you can also, if people want to ask your question in person, you can use the feature at the bottom of Zoom. There's a little React section that you click on, and there's a raise hand option to click on, and I'll know that it'll bump you up in my vision so I can see that you want to ask a question. So if you'd like to ask a question of our speakers, please do that. Raise hand, but Layla, you're very quotable. I have to say, I kept writing quotes of yours, and at the end, here's just a couple. The reasonable becomes the obstacle of the necessary. And I thought that was really, really powerful. And also, unity is not uniformity. And I really love that too, in response to kind of this accusation of infighting that we sometimes get. And, recently when I have seen this accusation of infighting, as you said, mostly it's just kind of a silencing of legitimate critiques and concerns about campaigns and strategy. So, let's not be afraid to talk about these things. We want to improve the movement and improve our thinking on this stuff. So, very, very amazing things. Okay, there is a question. I'm going to ask the first question, and then we will get to another question. But one thing that I want to just at the very front kind of to bring back into our focus that I think is really important, and you all touched on it, and that is language and how we use our language and what we can do to improve our language. Because I'm assuming that most everyone here is, in animal advocacy in some way and or wants to be, is exploring, and how we talk about it is, I think, so important. So one thing that Layla mentioned was not using the term factory farming, and this is something that, I have some strong opinions about as well. I might drop the article that I've written about it in the chat. And so, because now the industry has changed so much, when we say end factory farming, we're not necessarily saying end the exploitation of animals, end all animal farming. We're just talking about now what people see in their minds as a separate, evil entity of it, but now there's other options. There's cage free, there's free range, small farms, right? Another one that Faraz mentioned was suffering and using the term suffering and ending suffering. Because again, now, because of the trajectory that the industry and animal advocacy have taken, supporting all these labels, just ending suffering does not necessarily mean ending animal exploitation. It's all that trajectory that Layla was talking about, the end. What are we saying? What is the end point? What is it that we're trying to convey? So just I think that it's kind of a takeaway, take home, something that we all can do to try to find those times in our language that and make sure that everything that we say is zero animal exploitation. I think someone, maybe Faraz had that, or maybe Layla, on their slide. Zero animal exploitation. Is everything that we say and do reflecting that, right? I mean, it's to all of you. Would you like to say something about the language and maybe give some pointers and tips and things that we can say? Anyone want to start?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah. I was just so inspired when I saw Dr. Sailesh Rao of Climate Healers at the United Nations, and his central message was zero animal exploitation. Um, and I think these two phrases, stop factory farming and reduce suffering, has just been really, really problematic. And I hear it everywhere. And a lot of websites, animal protection websites, you go on it and they're saying the problem is factory farming. And
And that used to work.
yeah,
That
where's the
that
discussion about the
15 years
enslavement?
ago, that was the only option.
Right.
Stop buying animal products at all altogether. Yeah.
But it's the exploitation and the killing is not mentioned. And then whenever we go down that slippery slope of reducing suffering, then of course what is left in people's minds is, okay, well, as long as they don't feel anything, it's because they have an idea of humane slaughter, thanks to Temple Grandin and Michael Pollan and the omnivore's dilemma. Thank goodness for the omnivore's deception. It's a wonderful new book by John Sanbaimatsu. Um, I think that we really need to stop using these words like reducing suffering. I mean, we don't need to stop it, but as long as our message is very clear that the cause of the suffering is using and enslaving animals. So that's the message I try to get across all the time.
Wonderful. Anyone else want to pick up on this?
Yeah, I can say something. I mean, actually, I didn't say in my talk, not that I remember, that we shouldn't say factory farming. I think that was
Yeah,
Leah.
no, that's
Um,
yeah.
so,
And
so
that's me
It was
too.
me.
I
It was me. Layla and Leah, it's easy to get them mixed up.
right,
um,
oh, I'm sorry. I might have gotten it mixed up. Yeah.
no, but and I think I might be about to say something quite controversial, because I I think that, as I said in my talk, I think our asks can be incremental, but our messaging needs to be pointing to the goal. And whether it's freedom or whether it's, ending exploitation or however we want to frame it, it needs to be pointing. So ending factory farming is an incremental goal. Now, we may or may not agree with that, but I think that we can talk about factory farming as a step, ending factory farming as a step, as a big step to getting to animal freedom or ending exploitation. Now, and I think something that it's well, I think probably why a lot of people use it is because the public is generally in agreement that
Board, yeah.
factory. So I think there is an opportunity here to um, meet the public where they're at. Now, I hate it when people say this about vegan outreach. Oh, we've got to meet people where they're at. So, please don't hate me for saying this. But I think that there's a way to meet people where they're at and then take them on the journey. And if we were to define factory farming as involving confinement, mutilation, high yields, and artificial insemination, all the things, and not letting animals express their full natural behaviors, even though I feel like that's an industry kind of framing. Then I think we can show people that all farming is factory farming because it involves all of those things. So I wonder if there is a kind of a sly kind of thing that we can do in terms of, yeah, we should end factory farming. Yes, we should end factory farming, and then be exposing people to what that actually means and actually getting people along that journey in terms of, well, all farming is factory farming because all farming sees other animals as units of production. Um, but I think it's the overall message that's really important, and the asks can be incremental, but obviously we need to choose those asks strategically as well. So that's my 2 pence.
Yeah, just add something very quick. I um because like everyone's idea is that with factory farming, everybody agrees that it's wrong. The issue I've had is that it just doesn't lead to any meaningful action. So when I talk to students, they're like, "Oh yeah, this is clearly wrong." I'm like, "But you understand that when you go to dining hall, this is where," and then they just go to the next excuse. I was like, "All right, fine, let's just stop here and agree that this is wrong. What are you gonna do about it?" The answer is nothing. It doesn't change anything. I'm not sure. Maybe in terms of policy, it might be different, but in terms of like individuals, I think. And then I tried something new actually because I really just want to give everything an open mind. And so we tried something that was, excuse my language, it was something that was suggested by some animal rights movement leaders, and we wanted to like try it. It was like fuck factory farming. And so what we did was we had a banner that said like fuck factory farming, but on beneath that, and we wrote that there is no humane treatment of animals, or like humane is lie or something like that. I can't remember the exact words. To just say that, yeah, factory farming is definitely horrible, people stop by, but then we would make a case that there is no humane way to do it, because otherwise that would be their alternative. And um, Yeah, I also agree that there are ways to meet people where they are without still like compromising the message to help them. As someone who does a lot of outreach, I found that just empowering people to see the um, cognitive dissonance, and as long as it comes from a place of kindness and compassion, and you say, if it was a dog, you would never be okay with like a humanely raised dogs, and they just get it. Um, and I think we can still do that without compromising on the message. So just leave it at that.
Yeah, okay. Well, my concern is that I just have people all the time saying, "Well, my meat isn't factory farmed. My eggs aren't factory farmed. I'm doing the right thing." So, I guess it has to do with how much time we have to unpack that message and where it's presented. Because if it's quick and small, and you don't have the further time. Anyway, this is a big debate, of course, about what specific language to use, but maybe just something to think about for people, and the suffering one as well. That being careful of saying, well, we want to end animal suffering. Well, what does that mean? And how does that look further? Anyway, okay, so let's get to another question.
Actually,
Oh
Hope, can
yeah,
I just say one other thing?
yeah.
Just that I like when I started working for In Defense of Animals, even the folks there in all the content that I'd seen before I started there, it was all factory farming. And slowly but surely, I've made sure that in all the language, like, nope, let's replace that phrase with animal farming, all animal farming. So I think you were saying it's hard to unpack it, you need time to explain, but basically, if you can get across that all animal farming has inherent cruelties to them, including the slaughterhouses, that's pretty simple message. Because again, like Faraz said, everybody always already agrees that factory farms are bad, but the problem is the implication is small family farms good, and that's what animal ag is trying to convince everyone of. So anyway.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah. Okay. All right, let's move on to a question. Is it Akeo? How do you pronounce your name?
Ica.
Aiko. Okay, Aiko, please.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to the speakers. I really enjoyed listening to your talks. I have a question to whoever of you wants to jump in and answer. I am currently doing a PhD in psychology about humane washing. And as I'm also quite in the beginning of my project, I also still have quite some space to give it room and to um, yeah, define it in the way that I want to. I was wondering if you have any ideas what you think would be most valuable as insights, like scientific insights about humane washing, specifically from the consumer's perspective. What kind of insights do you think would be most helpful for our vegan advocacy movement?
Who'd like to start? Resources. Aiko needs resources. Uh,
Yeah,
well,
well,
so,
I could start with,
go ahead.
well, I created a page on the In Defense of Animals website called Humane Washing Exposed. So it just kind of goes over all of the standard practices and how it's all horrific. I also think what's so important is getting across to people the inherent corruption of the system and that we are being lied to. I think that's really important because then that starts bringing people in like, wait a minute, I don't want to be lied to. You mean to say that all these labels aren't true? And then you kind of go over with them the standard practices in all animal farming. That's sort of the first step for me. But getting across that the USDA in the United States, for instance, the agency in charge of overseeing and supposedly reporting and inspecting is the same agency in charge of promoting and marketing the industry and funding it. So just letting people know that, I think the light bulb starts to go out or off with people and they start to realize this entire system is just for profit and is will do anything that they can to make money.
Yeah. Yeah, I just dropped a link to the article, some articles on our Humane Hoax website that you might be interested in. And I believe, Faraz, did you mention, someone mentioned a study that an effective altruism had person had done. What was that? I didn't know about that. That
Yeah,
or Layla, was
I
that
think
you?
I think I mentioned it.
Yeah,
It's a
Layla.
2024 study by, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, Steen, or it might be a her, Stijn Brewers. And it's called something like "Is welfare labeled meat a stepping stone?" or something like that. I did quote it in my, yeah, it's worth reading. I mean, and he finds that it really it's a new destination. It's not a stepping stone. So I think more research like that would be great.
Can you find a link to that, or
Oh,
maybe
yes.
it Ico's information or something?
Yes.
If you could
Yeah.
give him that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Um,
just want to add, fantastic. Like amongst everything that you can do with your PhD, you picked a very good topic, and we definitely need more academics. And also realize that most of your impact will be after your PhD, what you're gonna do with that. My biggest recommendation to you is that at the end of the day, you have to become someone who connects academia with real life changes. Because one other paper is not gonna save, like the animal liberation is not like dependent on one more paper. We just need scientists with scientific background who can read the data and interpret it and connect it to public and bring it back to people. Like I think Melanie Joy, I do have some disagreements with how she puts out the message, but I still admire her for spending like a lot of people study psychology, but she used that to really get into the bottom of why people consume animal products and how to communicate that with public, right? So don't become a boring scientist, just become a scientist who can actually like communicate this and connect with me. I would love to brainstorm more. I think one thing that would be very interesting to see, I mean, I have a hunch. I don't think you need a paper to show that, but to show that when someone consumes cage-free eggs, for instance, would that be easier to get them go vegan Or would it be easier to do that with someone who knows that the eggs are? And then also collecting data. Do these people who consume like pasture raised, do they understand that all male chickens have to still be killed? That all these chickens have already be manipulated so that they lay about 275, 300 eggs per year. These are not normal chickens that they would imagine. It would be really interesting to show that how little people actually know with like data. But let's connect. I would love to help more.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's. Thanks. I fully agree with you, by the way. I'm definitely not going to be a boring, silent scientist.
Yes, but we need the academics. We need those studies. We need those papers. It's really important, I think, to have advocates in higher academia and higher learning. So I'm glad to see you doing this. Absolutely. And yeah,
One
Leah.
other thing, I definitely would love to recommend the Humane Hoax book. This is incredible anthology that Hope Bohanec put together, and she's written articles in it, and then there's some incredible articles in there that really kind of um, really breaks down what this humane hoax is all about. And then I mean, I couldn't be more excited and honored to be on this with both Layla and Faraz. I honestly can think of, I mean, they are just right at the first two people that I think of, honestly. So I would go to Project Phoenix. Their Substack, Have We Lost Our Nerve as a Movement, that Layla wrote, incredible. And go to Allied Scholars for Animal Protection's website. I mean, really check that out because they've got pretty much everything that you need. So I just wanted to shout out these incredible people here. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you, Leah. And I think 10 or 11 of the contributing authors in my book were PhDs. Uh, so definitely academics in that book. And I know that Vasile is on this. Vasile Stanescu often speaks at our events, and I know I think he's here. So that's another academic to connect with, academic that is applying the work and applying it to real life advocacy. All right, so well, let's move on to another topic, and I wanted to ask about. Um, so, well, okay. You all talked about kind of like the end goal being, you know, included in the message. I mean, we just talked about this with language, right? And not having a confused moral message, I think someone said. And you know, and I think Layla said looking at each individual campaign, you know, evaluating and something that I often say is it moving us in the direction of animal freedom or just diverting us on a path of buying, you know, alternative products and making more money for the industry. So maybe talking a little more about this, like, oh, I know, Layla, your language is helping to legitimate the industry, which I think is so important. And I think of like the Better Chicken commitment, which has so much energy around it. I mean, you know, there's so much uh, advocacy dollars in the form of jobs going into this better chicken commitment that nobody knows about. Like the public doesn't even know about this, right? That I think very few people actually know what this is. I mean, everybody knows what cage-free eggs are, but the better chicken commitment, you know. So things like this, you know, does this move us in the direction of animal freedom, or does it just help legitimate the industry? And I wonder if anybody wanted to talk a little more about that because I think it's such an important factor uh, in all this and in how we assess what we put our activist time into.
I just had something here, like, uh, you are spending all this money and all these campaigns to make one ask. And let's this industry actually does that. Then what comes next? Are you just, what are you gonna do next? Are you like, what is better chicken commitment? What is your next ask to stop them from like killing animals? And I think I want to also actually point out something about the factory farming. When you get people to sign, can you sign here that factory farm is bad, and everyone signs that. The second they understand that this means for them to eat less meat, then they're just going to say, oh, no, that I didn't realize that's what I'm signing, right? Because they don't understand what the core issue here is. And I think the biggest question here is that what else can that money do? Like the opportunity cost. That the cage-free campaign, all these commitments don't come at the cost of like nothing, right? They take the entire animal rights movement, for people who don't know, globally has about $300 million, which is like nothing. And most of it goes to cage-free campaigns. So that's a real issue. I give you one example that it's not like advocacy, it's not abolitionist advocacy, but it's absolutely helpful. All the plant-based foods that you're eating, all the Beyond Burger, and that has made it so much easier for people to become vegan today. All those products are a product of about 10 years of R&D compared to thousands of years for dairy cheese. Imagine if that money went into making plant-based foods taste better. It tastes definitely good for me, but like I'm just saying, like for average muggle who's really stuck at the taste of vegan cheese doesn't melt. Um, Imagine if the money went to making those options more accessible. And so the question always, and the education, right? What else could that money do? I think to me that's the biggest threat.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's out of balance. And I think Layla and I talked about this on my podcast when I had her on my podcast, is that it's not necessarily that these welfare campaigns shouldn't exist. It's just that we're so out of balance with so much of our energy going towards these welfare campaigns and the grassroots and animal sanctuaries and, people in the street that is starving for energy and attention and air and airtime. So yeah, there's definitely an imbalance. Anybody else want to talk about that at all?
I think the message of incremental change will happen regardless. So it's a question of how fast or how slow do we want it to be? And yes, we can. I think, law and policy can focus on pressuring corporations and pressuring to enforce and transparency. But the key is, what is the message that's being gotten across? Exactly what Layla said. And as for us, I mean, as we're advocating for if one particular cruelty or trying to stop one particular thing in stages, all important is what is the message we're getting across. It's not that this is going to help animals and so then we're done and everybody feel great about it now that you've signed this petition. This is just one step towards ending animal exploitation. We have to be very clear about that. And I think stating what you want, starting with what you want, not starting with the compromise, is the only way to eventually get what you want. But I'm not against, small improvements, but the key is, what is the message? And the better, I put the logo of Better Chicken Commitment on one of my slides because, I mean, absolutely, I find that very damaging. And again, I mean, Burger King has that logo. It's just a different breed of chicken. And what is it doing? It's actually giving animal ag yet another way to get across to the public. Look, you can trust us. And there's some animal advocates that are campaigning for this. So I feel it's just kicking the ball further down the road. It's not the direction we should be going in anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So someone had asked earlier, I'll read their question uh, and then I thought they said, could you speak more about why cage-free campaigns are so heavily promoted in the animal advocacy movement? I think a big push and ongoing work came around Proposition 2 in California. I suspect part of the reason is that these campaigns are easier to build public support around, and I'd love to hear others' thoughts. I think it's interesting because I worked on Proposition 2 back in, what was that, 2007. I was the Sonoma County coordinator for Proposition 2, and it made me, and looking at the legislative work was frustrating for me because I just saw so little change when it would go into effect. There was really nothing, I don't feel, and that helped. But one of the things that the campaign kept saying is, oh, but we're recruiting people and we're getting people on board, which it did. A lot of people did come in through that movement. But another thing that they would say is that that these campaigns hurt the industry, that they're going to have to pay more money to, make the facilities different, and it's going to cost more, and it's going to hurt the industry so they'll, start going production will start going down, things like that. This was kind of the line. And I honestly, I feel like that has been kind of debunked. I mean, I don't think that that is happening. I think they're making more money now on cage free. So that doesn't really work. So what is the reason? And I know that I kind of know one of the answers, and the big answer is around effective altruism and the influx of effective altruism money and philanthropy, where and I think Faraz even said, they look at, the numbers of chickens that can be affected, right? So you've got whatever, 100,000 chickens that will be affected by this cage-free campaign. But what affected in what way? Is it really an improvement to their lives and worth the effort, money, and energy that goes into it? So, anyway, with all that said, anybody want to talk about that? Yeah, Layla.
Yeah, let me jump in. I well, I've got a couple of questions for you, Hope. Firstly, did the mobilization of volunteers around Prop 2 actually bring people into the movement so they stayed in the movement?
Yeah. Some of
That's
the
interesting.
long-term activists and vegans that I still work with in Sonoma County came in through
Okay.
Prop 2.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I do feel like that's a positive, isn't it? In terms of the argument about increasing costs, I mean, I just feel like the system absorbs the costs, and then so this doesn't make any difference to actually the system itself. And I think, as you said, the reason that there is so much focus on cage free is to do with effective altruist money, and I think that we have so effective altruism, as far as said, it's about decreasing suffering. It's a different goal to, I think, the social justice movement goal of ending injustice, of ending this system. And so I think then different strategies emerge. But I think effective altruism also has a very different worldview, compared to, I think, more social movement orientated. And I think I mean, I could talk, this is a whole other presentation, so I could talk about this at length. But I think one of the key things that effective altruism doesn't include in their theory of change is the role of power. And I think building long-term power is the thing that social justice movements have done historically, because this is a power struggle. And rather, their theory of change is more focused on the sort of more inside game, whether it's philanthropy, whether it's the policy work, whether it's corporate campaigning, but it doesn't focus on long-term power building. It doesn't focus on ending the system, on transforming the system. It focuses on optimizing within the system. And so I think cage free can be, and better chicken commitment, all of these things are about reducing suffering. And Martin Balloch, who's the Austrian example, like, it was very confusing for me, because I was like, I'm against cage free, but I really like Martin and he's doing cage free. So what's going on here? And at CARE last year, he said very clearly in this fireside chat, in a conference which was very cage-free orientated, my goal is not reducing suffering, it is ending injustice. And I think that is what we have to keep in mind. And maybe we are two different movements. I don't know. I think we have to really think about this. If we have two different goals, freedom is not the goal of effective altruists. I don't even, yeah, it's reducing suffering, which could, be an indefinite thing. And then, obviously the Peter paper even shows that, like, all of these calculations are so hard to make realistically. So yeah, I mean, that's my 2 pence. I could go on, but I think the answer is money. I think it's the technocratic mindset, because a lot of EA money comes from Silicon Valley. Like, I think it's all within the paradigm of this is the paradigm in which, why we're in the mess we are in as a society, in terms of all the interconnected crises that we're facing, is this technocratic, linear, sort of uber rational kind of worldview that doesn't take into account second and third order effects, that doesn't view this as, complex systems. It's all very,
Right.
very linear, very simplistic, and it doesn't include power, which to me is the most important thing that we need to build in order to transform the system. Okay, I'll stop now.
Yeah, that was so much. Oh, there's so many things. So good. And yeah, it is the focus on kind of the numbers and the linear and rational mind kind of stuff instead of looking at the larger emotional picture, virtue ethics, those kinds of things. I mean, this effective altruism is super utilitarian and it's a not a great way to look at the world, I would say. But then you were saying two different movements, and we felt that back in the 90s, we would say there are two different movements. There's the animal rights movement and there's the animal welfare movement. But the animal welfare movement at the time was like the Humane Society and people that worked for dogs and cats and people that wanted to, just get bigger cages for the dogs and cats, right? But now it's kind of like merged somehow. And now, people that are animal rights, that are vegan, that want to work for vegan, are like, I'm going to get a job in animal rights, are suddenly working for a cage-free campaign that is welfare oriented. And they're not really moving in the same direction as I think that they wanted to, or at least, we're trying to analyze that. So it's interesting. It's a very interesting trajectory. But when you say power, and I know everybody, I just want to say, you mean like people power, right? When you say when
Uh,
we
I'm talking
more
about different
power,
forms. Yeah, I think I'm talking about different forms of power. Primarily, I'm talking about people power, but
right?
I'm also talking about narrative power. I'm also talking about network power, like
Oh,
being
yes.
networked as a movement in working towards shared goals. And I'm talking about institutional power, the power to get things on the agenda of, decision makers.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think, there's lots of different power frameworks. That's the one that we use. And we need all of those different forms of power in order to really ultimately to pull power away from the system, away from the pillars that uphold the status quo, whether that's business, media, the judiciary. Um, so yeah, that's what I'm talking about. And that's a
Yeah.
long-term project that involves investing in grassroots, that involves investing in um, experimenting and learning, not certain things, because we don't know what the pathway is to.
Yeah.
But we need a movement that's able to respond to opportunities and trigger events and on all of those things. It's a very different way of looking at it than sort of an effective altruist approach.
And you talk about all that on our podcast, on the Hope for Animals podcast with Layla on my podcast. So please listen to that to get even more about all that. We talk all about that. Faraz, you wanted to mention something?
Yeah, I think one of the most heartbreaking things that I heard was I was giving a talk at Yale, and before my talks, I usually go around and ask people like what brought them to the talk. And this guy was from EA, and he said, I used to be vegan, and I said, what happened? And I was like, yeah, I just now donate to cage-free campaigns, right? That's so when I said that it can actually change the conversation and take somebody from Yale who would have been a leader for animal rights otherwise, now is reduced to, I'm just going to be a part of a problem. You cannot solve a problem if you're a part of a problem. You can't run a anti-slavery movement if you're racist, Loki. And that's a power that I see every single day that we are losing. And so I think Layla said that in a most beautiful way. Um, that every time that we promote this kind of campaigns, we are losing opportunities, we are losing people, and nothing in practice will change. It's heartbreaking. And to answer your question, I think it is money and ease of um, ask. So many people don't want to go vegan. They rather just pay money to someone. But if you are not vegan and if you don't fundamentally understand why eating eggs is wrong, then of course you're just gonna pay a company that promotes better chicken commitment or better, cage free. So so it's literally a broken cycle that you ask for money from people who don't understand why they're donating. Sure, you get more money, but all that money will go to welfare campaigns that just makes more people feel good about themselves, right? I also think that when you look at their spiels, right, when they give like speeches about why chickens are suffering so much, the whole thing is great. It's the last thing that they're asking is usually wrong. Like you can still show people that chickens are suffering tremendously, and then the ask would be, "Help us end this." It's really just that little ask at the end that sort of like ruins it. And you can always get money from different ways and spend it the way that you want. For instance, I know a lot of organizations, they mainly focus on veganism, but the message they put out there is like, look at the cats and dogs that we rescued, because that's what get people like donate. And that's okay. You just get money however you want, and then you just spend it. So I think that's just another issue, and the ease of ask, because it's a lot easier. I had one of the ASAP chapters stop being ASAP because they wanted to do welfareism. Why? Probably it's just because if you ask people to go vegan, it takes a certain degree of courage to confront people, to ask, to learn how to talk about it. With cage free, you don't have to be the bad guy. You don't have to be that extreme vegan or militant vegan. All you have to say is that, while you're eating your eggs, would you also donate $5 to this campaign and treat chickens like carbon credit, right?
Yes, Leah.
Yeah. Yeah, everything that both of them have said. Uh, there's, yeah, the power in the effective altruist movement. It's the money. And I think people realize that they're going to get a lot more donations from people if they're not asking them to go vegan, you know. It's pretty fundamental, I think. And I mean, I went to the Animal and Vegan Advocacy Summit for the first time last year, and I didn't see all that much big banners or any advocacy against ending all of it. It was, like Faraz said, there was a big fuck factory, pardon me, factory farm sign. But that really seemed to be, again, the message and reducing suffering. And there's a huge convention in San Francisco a few weeks back or whatever, AI for animals. And you go on the website and it was, again, reducing suffering, better welfare. I didn't see any education about veganism or ending all of it. And I've experienced this, working for an organization where, understandably, they've been around a long time. And when they started, it was through research and animal testing and an activist that really got an incredible amount of attention for protesting and really making a huge stink about research labs and the torture of dogs and animals in research labs. And so that gets a lot of attention, fantastic, right? And you start getting a lot of members and donations. But then if you want to start actually advocating against eating animals, that becomes a lot more difficult. So there's that, philosophy of, well, start with talking about dogs and cats, and then you'll bring people in, and then you could slowly, talk about veganism. But as the person representing veganism and farmed animals at this organization, like I'm the one that's really putting that message out there. But that's risky sometimes because then you'll start to get pushback from donors. So, but I think the answer is, like Faraz said, it's all about practice, and we all need to learn how to speak to people about this, and that it can be with maturity, common sense. But I think it's very important to like get rid of this notion that if you're advocating for veganism or simply animal freedom and not exploiting them at all, it doesn't have to be associated with an extreme view. It doesn't have to be associated even with the word abolition, but there's a way to do it. And the most important thing, though, is educating people. And I mean, every vegan I know who became an activist is because they saw people that inspired them because they were simply speaking up. And I think that's what people need to see. So I think a lot of advocates and organizations just assume that people don't want to hear that message. But I think more people are waiting to hear a solid truth telling message from just people like us, who are giving facts and information, but are just not afraid to just speak truthfully. That's what people need to see and hear. And I think organizations underestimate the power of that because that's what freed the slaves. I mean, that's how we got justice in all these other issues, right? Is seeing people who were willing to just speak truthfully. And if we got a coalition together, like in the same way, very small example of this, but just those 47 plus international scholars that simply wrote an open letter and sent it out to a bunch of organizations, reconsider cage free in the direction we're going in. We can do that, all of us who are speaking truthfully and advocating for veganism, all us organizations and advocates and in other sectors, put together a letter, just start a coalition and start getting people and experts from all these different industries who see us speaking up and who can back us up. And that's how we can start to pressure these institutions, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leah. Fantastic. Well, I think we might wrap up. There doesn't seem to be any other particular questions, and we've covered a lot. So what I will do is ask, is there any other question? I mean, if anyone want to raise a hand or anything, just a last question. People are saying that they have to move on, which I understand. So, okay, I think we will wrap it up. So I just would love to give a last moment to each speaker, if you'd like, to just any final thoughts, any wrap-ups, anything you've got going on, coming up, your organization, whatever you want to say. Final thoughts from anyone. Who'd like to start? Or do you want to do that at all?
Well, since I'm the only one unmuted,
Okay, go ahead.
I'll just say, please support the organizations who are unabashedly telling the truth and who aren't just focusing on factory farms, who are advocating for veganism plainly. Start there. Yeah, and support the Hope and Layla and Faraz and their organizations too. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. All right.
Thank you. I say something that Philip Wallen said, that if you'd seen what I've seen, you'd be just like me. I'm a prisoner of what I know. I'm a victim of what I've seen. I can't change. I won't change. I will never change. I'm only going to become worse. That's how exactly I feel, and let's just get worse. Thanks for caring about animals so much. There are very few people who are abolitionists, and yeah, much respect for that. So thanks.
Thanks, Faraz. Layla?
Yeah, I would just say that every single one of us has unlimited potential and power, and we have to activate it in service to something greater than us. And I think that we're probably all operating on a very small percentage of what is possible for all of us. And I think one of the most important things that the movement needs is an unstoppable mass movement of activated people speaking truth, working collectively and achieving systemic wins. And I think that, we're doing this in the UK through the Animal Freedom Movement, the Animal Freedom Network. We're building local groups and building, up leadership, like mass leadership development. I think we need this everywhere because while, the professionalized movement has the money, we have the people. And I think we can shift the narrative through collective action of volunteers, of committed, dedicated people who have activated their power and agency. And that's every single one of us here.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you all. You all are so inspiring to me. Someone asked to repeat how they can get the recording. They're going to be available on the Humane, they'll be available on the Humane Hoax website, so humanehoax.org. They'll also be on the Compassionate Living YouTube page. And if you subscribe to Compassionate Living's e-news, we'll send out an event, and I'll send it out to everybody that registered. I'll just do that. I'll send out the links to everyone who registered. That'll be the easiest. So you all will get this for sure.
I have to say one clarification. I'm so sorry. In Defense of Animals absolutely advocates for veganism. I did not mean to say I'm the only one. I just meant to say I'm focused on farmed animals. So.
Well, yeah, they have a whole campaign. You head up their entire campaign for it. So
yes, but I want to, give props. They absolutely advocate for veganism. So
yeah, for sure. Wonderful. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for your care, your consideration, and for caring about this issue. I think this is kind of our 21st century kind of thing to unravel in the animal advocacy movement. So thank you for caring about it. Thank you for learning about it. Please, share all this information once you get the recordings, and go out there and talk to people about it. We appreciate you so much. All right. Yay. Thanks, everyone. Actually, if you want to, you can turn on your audio and everybody can thank everybody. Thank the one last shout out to everyone if you want to. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thanks,
you.
everybody. It
Thank
was a
you.
great event. Really appreciate your time and talent.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Awesome, awesome.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.